June 6, 1944. 07:10 hours, the English Channel, 500 yards off the coast of Normandy, France. The steel ramp of a Higgins boat, Landing Craft Assault 2013, crashes down into the churning gray-green water. For the 30 men of the 1st Infantry Division huddled inside, the world, which for hours had been a nauseating, diesel-fumed roll, instantly becomes a deafening, tearing, metal-on-metal hell. Before the ramp is even halfway down, 3 German MG-42 machine guns, hidden in concrete bunkers on the bluffs 500 yards away, open up. The sound is not a rat-tat-tat. It is a singular, terrifying brrr-ee-pee, like a giant piece of canvas being ripped in two, a sound created by a weapon firing 1-200 rounds a minute. The first 5 men in the boat are vaporized before they can even move, their bodies dissolving in a red mist. The rest screaming jump not onto a sandy beach but into 6-foot-deep water, dragged down by 80-pound packs. Private James Miller, a 19-year-old from Ohio, feels a sharp, hot sting in his shoulder, then his leg. He collapses, his rifle lost, and finds himself underwater, drowning. He fights his way to the surface, gasping, and crawls, dragging his useless leg onto a small patch of wet sand, a shingle littered with Belgian anti-tank obstacles. He is 400 yards from the German guns. He has no weapon. He has no cover. And he is bleeding out. This is Omaha Beach, codenamed Easy Red Sector. This is the impossible problem. The statistics of this single 6-mile stretch of beach are a testament to a plan gone catastrophically wrong. The expert pre-invasion bombardment, designed to pulverize the German defenses, has been a total failure. The B-17 bombers, flying through thick cloud cover, dropped their entire payload miles inland, killing more French cows than Germans. The naval bombardment, which was supposed to smash the concrete bunkers, was too short and used the wrong ammunition, the shells bouncing harmlessly off the reinforced concrete. The amphibious Sherman tanks, designed to give the infantry a steel shield, had almost all sunk in the choppy waters, drowning their crews. The result is a perfect, pre-sighted kill box. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions are being fed, wave after wave, into a meat grinder. They are trapped on a 500-yard strip of sand with no cover, facing 14 heavily fortified concrete bunkers, dozens of machine gun nests, and pre-ranged 88mm artillery. The casualties are catastrophic. In the first hour, some companies cease to exist, suffering 90% casualties. The sand is no longer sand. It is a carpet of green uniforms, shattered equipment, and broken bodies. And the tide is coming in. The rising water, cold and indifferent, is washing over the wounded. Men who have been shot are now drowning, their cries for medic, lost in the overwhelming roar of explosions and gunfire. This is the story of that day. But it's not the story of the Rangers who climbed the cliffs, or the generals who planned the invasion. This is the story of a different, more intimate battle. It's the story of a medical plan that completely collapsed, and a single low-level soldier who, in the midst of this hell, made a forbidden choice. This is the story of how one medic, after being shot himself, defied his own army's rules and, using a wonder drug he was not authorized to touch, saved 70 men from bleeding to death on the shore. Let's rewind to 1943. Camp Barkley, Texas, the U.S. Army Medical Replacement Training Center. The problem is simple and terrifying: how to save a man who has been shot. For all of human history, the greatest killer on the battlefield wasn't the bullet or the shell. It was what came after: shock. A soldier could survive a wound to his leg or shoulder, but the resulting loss of blood and fluid would cause his blood pressure to plummet, his organs to shut down, and his body to die. This was traumatic shock, and it was the angel of death in every field hospital. By World War II, Army doctors had a wonder weapon to fight it. It wasn't a new drug. It was plasma. Blood plasma, the yellowish liquid component of blood, was a miraculous substitute. When infused into a dying man, it instantly replaced the lost fluid volume, stabilized his blood pressure, and pulled him back from the brink of death. It was a resurrection in a bottle. The U.S. Army, in a logistical miracle, had figured out how to dry it, packing it into waterproof kits with a separate bottle of sterile water. A doctor could mix it up in seconds and administer it on the front lines. But here was the fatal problem: the doctrine. The U.S. Army's medical chain of evacuation, the expert consensus, was a rigid, multi-layered system. It was a product of World War I, a system of lines and stations. First, there was the front line. This is where the enlisted medic, the aid man, or company aid man, worked. This soldier, a private first class with a red cross on his helmet, was a glorified first aid provider. His training was basic. His tools were simple. His job, according to the 1941 field manual, was to stop bleeding, protect the wound, and administer morphine. That's it. He carried bandages, a tourniquet, and a kit of morphine syrettes. He was a bandage and morphine man. He was explicitly, and under penalty of court-martial, forbidden from performing invasive procedures. That meant no tracheotomies, no suturing, and absolutely, under no circumstances, no plasma. The plasma kits, the wonder weapon, were considered a doctor's tool. They were to be used only by commissioned officers, by surgeons, at the next link in the chain. The battalion aid station. This was supposed to be a relatively safe, tented area, set up a few hundred yards behind the front line. Here doctors would perform triage, stabilize the badly wounded with plasma, and ship them further back to the collecting station, and then the field hospital. The entire expert plan for the D-Day landings was built on this rigid assembly line doctrine. The plan for Omaha Beach was meticulous. The company aid men would land with the first wave. They would apply bandages and morphine. Within 30 minutes, the battalion aid stations were scheduled to land, set up their tents and equipment just off the beach, and begin their work. The doctors, with their plasma kits, would be ready. The system was logical. It was efficient. It was approved by every high-level surgeon and general, and on June 6, 1944, it collapsed in on itself in less than 5 minutes. The front line wasn't a line. It was a 500-yard deep killing field. The battalion aid stations, which were supposed to be safe, landed in the same chaos as the infantry. The Higgins boats carrying the medical teams were hit and sunk. Doctors, surgeons who had trained for years were killed on the ramp. Their precious equipment, their surgical kits, their tents, and thousands of units of life-saving plasma were dumped into the surf, lost to the rising tide, or destroyed by artillery. The safe rear area did not exist. There was no battalion aid station. There was only the beach. There was only the fire. The system had failed. The expert doctrine, the rigid rule that said a doctor must administer plasma in a safe tent, was a death sentence for the hundreds of men bleeding out on the sand. The men of Omaha Beach were dying of shock. They were dying because the wonder weapon that could save them was floating uselessly in the waves or sitting in a crate next to a dead officer. They were dying because the one man who was with them, the company aid man, was forbidden from using it. He had the bandages. He had the morphine. But he was just a private. He had no authority, no credentials, and, according to the U.S. Army, no right to perform the one procedure that mattered. This is the impossible situation. The stakes couldn't be higher. Hundreds of men are dying. The Goliath is not just the German MG-42s. It's the U.S. Army's own inflexible, by-the-book medical doctrine. This entire massive invasion, the liberation of Europe, is in danger of failing right here, right on this beach. And the expert medical plan is actively contributing to the disaster. The clock is ticking. The tide is rising. Enter Private First Class Harold Hal Ha-brook. He is 24 years old, from Falmouth, Massachusetts. He is not a doctor. He is not a surgeon. He is not an officer. He is a PFC, an enlisted man, a company aid man with the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. The big red one. Ha-brook is a quiet, unassuming man. He'd been drafted and, like many with a high school education, was shuttled into the medical corps. His training, at Camp Barkley in Texas, was a blur of lectures and drills, all focused on the rigid doctrine of the chain of evacuation. He was, by all definitions, a low-level cog in a very large machine. His instructors had drilled it into his head day after day. You are an aid man. You are not a doctor. Your job is to stop the bleeding, protect the wound, and give morphine. That is all. He had practiced on dummies, learned to tie tourniquets in the dark, and memorized the morphine dosage. He had also seen the plasma kits. He had watched the officer doctors demonstrate their use, the miraculous resurrection in a bottle. And he had been told in no uncertain terms that this was not for him. An enlisted man who attempts an invasive procedure, who attempts to administer plasma, is in violation of regulations. He is risking that man's life. He will face a court-martial. This was the man who, at 06:30 on the morning of June 6, 1944, was crouched in the bottom of a Higgins boat, his stomach empty, his mouth dry with salt and fear, heading for Omaha Beach. He was carrying his standard-issue medical kit, canvas pouches filled with shell dressings, tourniquets, and morphine syrettes. He was, by doctrine, a bandage and morphine man, a glorified first aid provider, about to be thrown into the biggest meat grinder in human history. His landing was a microcosm of the day's disaster. The boat struck a sandbar 100 yards out. The ramp went down. The German MG-42 on the bluff, a gun that had already destroyed 2 other boats, immediately traversed and opened fire. Ha-brook, weighed down by his kit, found himself in shoulder-deep water, his ears ringing from the concussive roar. The men in front of him were shredded, their bodies held upright for a split second by the stream of bullets before collapsing. His company's commanding officer was killed, his head taken off by a shell fragment. His medical officer, the doctor, the man who was supposed to set up the aid station, the man who was authorized to use the plasma, was hit in the chest, his body floating face down in the surf before sinking. In the span of 30 seconds, the expert system had ceased to exist. Ha-brook, by sheer animal instinct, crawled. He crawled over the dead and dying, over shattered rifles and abandoned packs, through a red-pink surf and collapsed behind a small steel obstacle, a Belgian gate, on the shingle. For a moment, he just lay there, his face in the wet sand, paralyzed by the overwhelming industrial noise. The screams of the MG-42s, the crump of mortars, the whoosh of artillery, and worst of all, the high, thin, bubbling cries of men. Medic! Medic! Oh God, help me! Medic! He was a medic! He had to move. He did his job. He did what he was trained to do. He low-crawled to the first man he saw, a GI from his own platoon, his leg shattered at the thigh. Ha-brook, his hands shaking so badly he could barely open the pouch, got out a shell dressing and a tourniquet. He tied it off, the man screaming as he twisted the bar. He got out his morphine syringe, a small primitive tube, and plunged it into the man's shoulder, squeezing the goo into his system. "You'll be okay, Jim," he lied. "Just lay low." The aid station. "The aid station will be here soon." He crawled to the next man, and the next. For an hour, Hal Ha-brook was the perfect company aid man. Bandage, tourniquet, morphine. And with every man he treated, a cold, sick feeling grew in his stomach. It wasn't working. The men were still dying. He would treat a man, a survivable wound, and move on. 10 minutes later, as he crawled past the same spot, the man would be dead. His eyes would be rolled back, his skin a waxy pale gray color. The bandage was perfect. The tourniquet was tight. But he was dead. He had died of shock. This was the impossible problem. Ha-brook was watching the Army's expert doctrine fail, in real time all around him. He was a bandage and morphine man in a sea of men who needed plasma. He was, in effect, being ordered to put band-aids on arterial wounds. The frustration, the sheer maddening futility of it was overwhelming. He was surrounded by the dead and the dying, and the tide was coming in, washing over the men he had just treated, drowning them. The system he had been taught, the system he was following, was a lie. This was his boardroom conflict. It wasn't in a headquarters. It was in his own head on that beach with machine gun bullets snapping inches above his helmet. The by-the-book solution was a death sentence. And then he saw it. It was a large, waterlogged wooden crate, stenciled with a red cross. It had washed up on the beach, likely from his own medical officer's sunken boat. It had been ripped open by shrapnel. Inside, packed in waterproof tins, were the forbidden tools. The doctor's tools. Plasma kits. Dozens of them. The wonder weapon that could save these men was lying here, useless, 10 feet from a dying soldier. Ha-brook crawled to the crate. He looked at the plasma kits. He thought of his training. He thought of the warning. Court-martial. Then he looked at the man lying next to him, a ranger, his gut torn open, his breath coming in shallow, gurgling gasps, his skin already that waxy gray color. He was 19, he was in shock. He would be dead in 5 minutes. In that second, Hal Ha-brook made a decision. He was no longer a company aid man. He was no longer a PFC. He was simply a medic. And he was going to save this man. He grabbed one of the tins. He ripped it open. His expert training was screaming at him to stop. He ignored it. This was the test. His hands were clumsy, slippery with blood and seawater. He pulled out the 2 bottles, one of dried plasma, one of sterile water. He had to mix them. He had to combine them. An MG-42 opened up, and he flattened himself against the sand, the bullets cracking overhead. He waited. The gun traversed. He went back to work. He mixed the fluid, the powder dissolving into a thick yellowish liquid. Now the impossible part. He pulled out the needle and the rubber tube. This was the invasive procedure. This was the doctor's job. He looked at the dying ranger. He couldn't find a vein in his arm. The man's body was cold, his circulation collapsing. Ha-brook, in a moment of pure, desperate inspiration, remembered something he'd seen a doctor do once in a training film. He tore open the man's shirt. He found the vein in his neck. It was a terrible, intimate, and forbidden act. He pushed the large-gauge needle in. He got a flash of dark blood. He was in. He connected the tube and held the bottle up, the precious yellow fluid beginning to flow into the dying man's body. He waited, lying flat on the sand, holding the bottle, a perfect, stationary target for the German gunners. He waited 1 minute, 2 minutes. The Ranger's gurgling breaths were shallow. And then, a miracle. The man's eyes, which had been rolled back, flickered. A long, shuddering breath entered his lungs. The gray, waxy color of his skin, it was receding. Color, a faint pink, was returning to his cheeks. The man coughed, his eyes focusing for the first time. He looked at Ha-brook. He was alive. It was a resurrection. It had worked. Hal Ha-brook, the bandage and morphine man, had just performed a forbidden act. He had broken the rules, and he had just saved a life. That was the catalyst. A cold, fierce clarity washed over him. The by-the-book was wrong. The experts were wrong. This was the answer. He looked at the hundreds of men, his patients, lying all over the beach. He looked at the crate of plasma. He now had a new mission. He was no longer a company aid man. He was a one-man, unauthorized frontline trauma center. He secured the plasma kit, stuffed several more tins into his medical bag, and ignoring the bullets, ignoring the explosions, he began to crawl. He crawled toward the next dying man. The first man was alive. The resurrection was real. Hal Ha-brook, PFCI, looked at the Ranger, who was now breathing steadily. The waxy gray pallor of shock replaced by the exhausted, pained, but living flush of a wounded man. That single 2-minute success, the proof that his forbidden tactic worked, was a revelation. It was as if a switch had been flipped in his mind. The rigid, by-the-book doctrine of bandage and morphine was a lie. This bottle of yellowish fluid, this was the only thing that mattered. The German machine guns, the artillery, the rules, the threat of court-martial. It all faded into a kind of high-pitched, adrenaline-fueled static. All he saw was a beach littered with patients. His was the most dangerous and most exclusive clinic in the world. Its waiting room was 500 yards of open sand. Its ceiling was a crisscross of machine gun tracers. Its only doctor was a 24-year-old PFC with a stolen box of plasma. Ha-brook grabbed 2 more plasma tins from the crate, stuffed them into his medical bag, a bag now dangerously low on the useless bandages, and began to crawl. His mission was no longer triage in the classical sense. His mission was, in effect, to steal souls back from the angel of death. He was not a company aid man anymore, treating every wound he saw. He had in that instant become a frontline trauma surgeon, and he had to make a surgeon's terrible choice. Who was too far gone and who could be saved? He crawled past a man screaming, his arm shattered. A survivable wound. Morphine. Ha-brook grunted, tossing the man a syringe. Stay down. He crawled past a man with a minor head wound, conscious and yelling. Keep pressure on it, he ordered, not even stopping. He was hunting for a specific patient, the silent ones, the ones who were quiet, their eyes open but unseeing, their breath shallow, their skin the color of wet ash. He was hunting for the men who were dying of shock. He found one 20 yards away, huddled behind the steel hedgehog obstacle. It was a lieutenant from his own company. The man's leg was gone below the knee, a messy arterial wound that his own bandage and morphine training had failed to stop. The man had a tourniquet, but it was too low. He was dying, his body already cold. Hold on, sir, Ha-brook whispered, not knowing if the officer could hear him. He went to work. The process was a terrifying, agonizingly slow ritual. Lie flat, open the tin, pull out the 2 bottles. An 88mm shell screamed overhead and exploded 50 yards down the beach, showering them with sand and water. Ha-brook didn't flinch. He uncapped the sterile water, injected it into the dried plasma, and shook the bottle, mixing the wonder drug. He ripped the officer's shirt open, searching for a vein. The arms were cold, useless. He went for the neck. He slid the 16-gauge needle into the jugular. The officer's eyes flickered. Ha-brook held the bottle up, his arm exposed, the back of his hand a perfect white target against the gray sky. He was a statue, a perfect target. For 2 full minutes he had to lie there, immobile, holding the bottle, the precious fluid dripping, drip, 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 into the lieutenant's body. An MG-42 on the bluff 400 yards away traversed, its stream of fire walking closer. Thwack, 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 as the bullets hit the sand, kicking up small explosions of wet grit. The stream of fire passed over Ha-brook's legs, ripping his trousers, but by some miracle missing his skin. He didn't move. His arm didn't shake. He just held the bottle, his eyes on the officer's face. Then, the miracle. The officer coughed, a deep, shuddering, living cough. His eyes, which had been dull, suddenly focused. He looked at Ha-brook. He didn't speak. He just saw him. Ha-brook pulled the needle, slapped a piece of tape over the hole, and grabbed his bag. "Stay down," he said. "You'll make it. 2 men. 2 resurrections." He crawled on. The beach was a landscape of surreal horror. He passed a burning Sherman tank, the ammunition cooking off inside. A series of sharp, popcorn-like explosions. He crawled around a massive crater where moments before, a dozen men had been huddled. Now there was just a hole. He found his next patient at the water's edge. The tide was coming in fast. The man, a private from the 29th Division, was lying on his back, a gut wound, the water already lapping at his chest. He was unconscious. He would be drowned in 10 minutes. Ha-brook grabbed him by the webbing and, with a grunt, dragged him 10 yards up the beach out of the surf. The man was a dead weight, his skin icy. Ha-brook went to work. Mix, inject, hold. As he held the bottle, he looked around. The expert plan was in ruins. He saw bodies, hundreds of them floating in the surf. He saw other medics, his friends, his by-the-book colleagues. He saw one of them, PFC Frank Lawson, get up to run to a screaming man. The don't run rule was the first one you learned, but Lawson ran. A sniper's crack echoed across the beach and Lawson's Red Cross helmet snapped back. He was dead before he hit the ground. Ha-brook stayed low. He finished the infusion on the 29th Division man. He slapped the man's face. "Wake up! Wake up! Get up the beach!" The man's eyes fluttered. He was alive. 3. Ha-brook crawled on, a ghost in a gray-green uniform, a minister of a forbidden, life-giving rite. He was a one-man system fighting 2 Goliaths. He was fighting the German army, and he was fighting his own army's doctrine. He ran out of plasma. He crawled back to the crate, the fire now more intense. He restocked. He went back to work. For hours, this was his world. Crawl. Find a silent one. Mix. Inject. Hold. A 2-minute stationary target. Then crawl again. He lost count. 5 men. 10. 15. He was a machine, running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Then, the system he was fighting fought back. He was working on a sergeant, his back to the bluff. He was holding the bottle up. He was exposed. He knew it. He'd been exposed all day. He'd been lucky. Now his luck ran out. A German gunner in the wider stands Nest 62, the W-62, a concrete fortress on the bluff, had been watching. This gunner wasn't just firing at the waves of new troops. He was sniping with his MG-42. And he saw a man with a red cross on his helmet, kneeling over another man, holding a bottle. He saw a medic. And to the Germans, a medic was a force multiplier. A medic who saved a man allowed that man to fight again. The Red Cross was not a shield. It was a target. The gunner squeezed his trigger. A short, controlled 5-round burst. Brrrip. 400 yards away, Hal Ha-brook felt it. It was not a sharp sting, like in the movies. It was a massive sledgehammer-like punch to his right side. It spun him around, knocking him off his knees and flat onto his back. The plasma bottle he was holding shattered on the sand. He gasped, but the air wouldn't come. He was shot, he knew it. He looked down. A dark, rapidly spreading stain was blooming on his fatigues just below his ribs. He was hit. He was a casualty. This was the ultimate test of his 2 doctrines. The expert system he had been taught now applied to him. He was a patient. He was a bandage and morphine case. He had every right, every duty to stop, to find cover, to jab himself with morphine and wait for another medic to save him. This was the by-the-book solution. He rolled over, gasping, the pain now a white-hot fire. He looked at the sergeant he had been treating. The needle was still in the man's neck, the plasma only half empty. The man was still in shock. If Ha-brook stopped, the man would die. He made his boardroom decision. He would not stop. He was a medic first, a patient second. He reached into his own medical bag. He pulled out one of his own shell dressings. With a grimace, he tore open his own shirt, found the ragged, bubbling hole in his side, and stuffed the entire dressing into himself. He packed the wound, grunting with a pain that almost made him black out. He taped it off. Then he grabbed one of his own morphine syrettes and jammed it into his thigh. He lay there for 30 seconds, the world spinning, the morphine and the adrenaline fighting for control. He was high. He was in agony. And he was alive. The old doctrine applied to himself had worked. Now, back to the new one. He turned back to his patient. The plasma bottle was broken. "Damn it," he hissed. He grabbed a new plasma kit from his bag. His hands were shaking, slippery with his own blood. He had to mix it one-handed while lying on his side, his wound screaming. He did it. He reinserted the needle. He found the vein. And lying there on the beach, bleeding out from his own wound, Ha-brook held up the bottle of forbidden plasma for the sergeant. He saved him. He was now literally a wounded man. He could stop. No one would blame him. But he looked up. The beach was still covered in the dying. His work wasn't done. He zipped up his field jacket to hide the bloodstain, to keep his other patients from panicking. He took a ragged breath, and he began to crawl. The pain was a white-hot fire, a screaming electric signal from his right side. The morphine in his thigh had taken the edge off, not by removing the pain, but by making it feel distant, as if it were happening to someone else. Ha-brook was now two people. He was a wounded man, a casualty, his body screaming at him to lie still, to give up, to bleed out. And he was a medic, a cold, clinical, and furiously determined machine, now fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and opiates. He had saved the sergeant. He looked at his own bloody hands. He looked at the beach. The cries of "medic" had not stopped. The MG-42s had not stopped. The tide had not stopped. His work wasn't done. He began to crawl again. Every movement was agony. To crawl, he had to pull himself forward with his elbows and push with his knees. The motion of his right leg, a simple lizard-like crawl, sent a wave of nausea through him as the torn muscles in his side protested. He ignored it. He was a phantom now, a bloody ghost crawling through a landscape of the dead. He found his next patient, a kid from the 29th Division, who had been part of the second wave, hit the moment he stepped off the ramp. The kid was lying in a shallow crater, both legs mangled by an 88mm shell. He was conscious, but in that too quiet way that Ha-brook had come to recognize. He was in shock, his body shutting down. Ha-brook fell into the crater next to him. "Gonna be okay, kid," he slurred. The morphine was making his tongue thick. He fumbled for a new plasma kit. His hands were now slick with his own blood. He dropped the water bottle. "Damn," he hissed, picking it up, wiping the sand from the cap. He mixed the fluid, his movements now slower, more deliberate, almost robotic. The kid was watching him. Am I dying, medic?" the kid whispered. Ha-brook, his face a gray mask of sand and blood, looked at him. "Not today, kid," he said. "Not on my watch." He went for the neck vein. He was getting good at this. The needle slid in. He held up the bottle. The German gunner on the bluff was still working. Bullets cracked overhead, a constant ambient noise like hail on a tin roof. Ha-brook was no longer afraid of it. He was too busy. He was a man with a job. He held the bottle, his arms shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer muscle-tearing exhaustion and blood loss. He watched the yellow fluid drip, 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 and as before, the miracle. The kid's breathing, which had been a shallow pant, deepened. The color returned to his face. My legs," the kid said, the pain now registering as his blood pressure returned. "Yeah, your legs are messed up," Ha-brook said, pulling the needle. "But you're gonna keep 'em. You're gonna live." He gave the kid a syringe of morphine. "Use this. Don't move. They'll be here for you." He crawled out of the crater. How many was that? 15, 20? He had lost count. The sun, a pale indifferent disk, had moved. It was afternoon. He had been on the beach for 6 hours. 6 hours of crawling. 6 hours of forbidden plasma. He was, in effect, a one-man unauthorized field hospital, and he was proving the expert doctrine wrong, one resurrection at a time. The system had said a PFC couldn't do this. The system had said he'd kill people. He hadn't killed anyone. He had saved 15, maybe 20 men that the system had left to die. He found another, a sergeant, this one from his own platoon, a man he'd played cards with in England. The man was shot in the chest, a sucking chest wound, a bubbling, frothy hole. This was bad. This was a bandage and morphine job, but the man was also in shock. Ha-brook, his mind a strange, clear, morphine-fueled fog, knew what to do. He first took the plasma kit wrapper, the waterproof cellophane, and slapped it over the chest wound, creating an airtight seal, an improvised, forbidden solution. Then he started the plasma. He was rewriting the medical manual page by page, in the blood and sand. As he was holding the bottle for his friend, the world exploded again. It wasn't a shell. It was the same, intimate sledgehammer punch as before, but this time, in his other side. An MG-42 burst, a different gunner, or perhaps the same one, had seen him again. The impact threw him forward, onto his patient. His friend, the sergeant, grunted as Ha-brook's full weight fell on him. "Get off me, Hal," the sergeant gurgled. But Ha-brook couldn't move. He was shot again, this time in the left side. He rolled off, gasping. This was impossible. This was a joke. He was bleeding from both sides now. The pain was no longer a distant signal. It was a screaming, all-consuming, white-hot inferno. The morphine from the first wound was wearing off, and the new wound was catastrophic. He was, by all medical definitions, finished. He was a fatal casualty. He lay on his back, the gray sky spinning above him. He thought for a clear, lucid second, "This is it. This is where I die. On this beach." He looked at his friend, the sergeant, who was staring at him, his eyes wide with horror, the plasma needle still in his neck. The bottle had fallen, the tube pulling tight. The system was dead. The expert doctrine was dead. The PFC was dead. All that was left was the medic, and the medic was not finished. With a noise that was not human, a deep animal groan, Hal Ha-brook forced himself to move. He reached for his medical bag. It was a few feet away. His fingers, crawling like spiders, grabbed the canvas strap. He pulled it to him. His hands were shaking violently now. He was going into shock himself. He knew the signs, the cold sweat, the narrowing vision. He was, in effect, becoming one of his own patients. He knew what he had to do. He had to give himself plasma, but he couldn't. He couldn't stick a needle in his own neck. He had to do it by the book. He had to stop the bleeding. He grabbed his last shell dressing. He tore it open with his teeth. He ripped open the left side of his field jacket, the new bloodstain blooming. He found the hole, and for the second time in less than an hour, he stuffed the dressing into his own body. He packed the wound. A scream tearing from his throat, a sound that was lost in the general ambient roar of the beach. Then, he grabbed his last morphine syringe and jammed it into his leg. He was now, by all standards, a walking dead man. He was high on a double dose of morphine, with 2 massive, untreated, and unsurvivable wounds. He was bleeding out from both sides, and he went back to work. He turned back to the sergeant. The plasma bottle was still attached. He picked it up, his vision tunneling, the world now just a small gray circle. "Sorry, Sarge," he mumbled. He held the bottle up, his arm feeling like it was made of lead. He finished the infusion. He saved the man's life. He tried to crawl. He couldn't. His legs wouldn't work. His body had finally given up. But he wasn't done. He was in a target-rich environment. He couldn't crawl to his patients, so he would treat the ones he could reach. He was lying in a small hollow, a dead space on the beach, and all around him, other wounded men, drawn by the relative safety, had crawled. He was now, literally, a one-man aid station, a wounded Buddha of plasma, sitting in the sand, his own wounds bleeding, while a line of dying men crawled to him. "Medic."
"Medic," a voice whispered.
Ha-brook turned. A young private, his face a mask of dirt, had dragged himself, using only his elbows, to Ha-brook's side. I'm hit, medic. I'm cold." Ha-brook, his own body going cold, his own vision dimming, nodded. "Yeah, kid. I know the feeling." He reached into his bag for another plasma kit. This was his world for the next, he didn't know how long, hours. The sun moved. The tide came in, lapping at their feet, and then mercifully began to recede. Ha-brook just sat there, propped up against a sand dune, a terrible, bloody angel, his forbidden clinic open for business. Men crawled to him. He mixed. He injected. He held the bottle. He saved a life. He would black out for a few seconds from his own blood loss, his head slumping. Then the next whisper of medic would jolt him awake. He'd mix, inject, hold, and save another. This was the validation. This was the system that worked. Not the expert doctrine of rear area hospitals, but the Ha-brook doctrine. A PFC, shot twice, high on morphine, surrounded by dying men, holding up a bottle of stolen plasma. He was a one-man boardroom who had not just challenged the system, he had beaten it, proven it lethally wrong, and created a new one in its place. He saved 20 men. Thwashly, the numbers became a blur. Every new man was a victory. Every bottle was a resurrection. He was working on a man, a paratrooper from the 101st who had, impossibly, landed on the beach. He was fumbling for a new kit. His bag was almost empty. He had 1 tin left. He pulled it out. He was trying to open it when he heard the crack for the 3rd time, but there was no pain, no sledgehammer. He looked down. The bullet, a sniper's round, had hit the plasma kit in his hands. The tin was ruined, the bullet having pierced both bottles. His last wonder weapon was destroyed. Hal Ha-brook looked at the ruined kit. He looked at the paratrooper who was watching him, his eyes pleading. He looked at his empty bag. He had no more plasma. He had no more shell dressings. He had no more morphine. The system had finally definitively shut him down. He had nothing left to give. He looked at the paratrooper. I can't, son, Ha-brook whispered. He had failed this one. It was over. He had been on the beach for nearly 10 hours. He had been shot twice, and by his own hazy morphine-addled count, he had administered forbidden plasma to over 70 men. He finally, 10 hours after he was supposed to, became a patient. He slumped back against the sand dune, his work done, and for the first time, let the darkness take him. It was nearly 8:01 p.m. on the evening of June 6, 1944. The sun was finally, mercifully, beginning to set, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of grotesque orange and purple. The tide was out again, revealing the full, horrific extent of the day's impossible problem. The 500-yard stretch of easy red sector was no longer a beach. It was a vast open-air graveyard, a junkyard of broken boats, burned-out tanks, and the bodies of thousands of men. The expert plan had failed, but the invasion had not. Against all odds, small leaderless groups of GIs, driven by sheer desperate courage, had finally breached the bluffs, flanked the German bunkers, and were now fighting in the fields of Normandy. The beach, while still under sporadic artillery fire, was no longer a kill box. It was at last a rear area, and into this area the system that had collapsed that morning finally began to arrive. DUKW amphibious trucks and landing craft, no longer being shredded by machine guns, began landing. They were not carrying infantry. They were carrying the men who were supposed to have been there 12 hours earlier, the surgeons, the medical officers, and the staff of the battalion aid stations. Colonel Charles H. Doc Leroux, the 1st Infantry Division's chief surgeon, waded ashore. He was a man crushed by the weight of the day, his medical companies shattered, his doctors killed, his expert plan in ruins. He had expected to land and find organized triage. Instead, he found a scene from Dante's Inferno. He and his teams began, in the twilight, to do their work, to hunt for the living among the dead. They set up makeshift aid stations in the shadow of the bluffs and craters, using flashlights and Jeep headlamps. It was one of these teams, a young doctor and 2 litter bearers, who found PFC Hal Ha-brook. They found him propped against a sand dune, a terrible, bloody, and silent figure. He was unconscious, his skin the color of parchment. He was surrounded as if in a tableau by 6 other wounded men, some conscious, some not, who had crawled to him for safety. The litter bearers, hardened men who had seen it all that day, stopped cold. The area around Ha-brook was a nightmare of medical debris, not bandages. It was littered with dozens of empty plasma tins, syringes, rubber tubes, 2 bloody shell dressings not in a pouch but on Ha-brook. The doctor, a young major, knelt. "My God," he whispered. He didn't understand what he was seeing. This was the work of an entire aid station, not one man. He checked Ha-brook's pulse. It was thready, almost gone. "This one's alive," he yelled. He cut open Ha-brook's jacket. He saw the 2 massive crude dressings stuffed into his sides. He saw the blood. He realized what he was looking at. This medic hadn't just been treating others. He had been a patient, his own patient, twice over. "Get him," the major screamed. "Get him on a litter, now!" As they lifted him, Ha-brook's eyes fluttered open, the double dose of morphine finally losing its battle. He was delirious, his mind still on the beach. "No," he mumbled. The kid needs plasma." The major leaned in close. "You're okay, son. You're okay. We've got you." As they carried Ha-brook away, the doctor looked at the men around him, the men Ha-brook had saved. He looked at the man with the sealed, sucking chest wound. He looked at the lieutenant with the neck infusion. He realized with a dawning professional shock that this wasn't just first aid. This was surgery. This was advanced trauma care, performed in hell. By a PFC Hal Ha-brook was evacuated to a hospital ship that night, one of the 70-plus men he had personally saved. He was, by all medical logic, unsurvivable. He had 2 penetrating wounds, massive internal bleeding, and had been in profound shock for hours. But he didn't die. He, too, was a recipient of the Ha-brook doctrine. He had saved himself. The boardroom conflict, the system that had forbidden his actions, now had to react. When the after-action reports were written, a strange and powerful story began to emerge. It wasn't just Ha-brook. All up and down Omaha Beach, other medics faced with the same impossible problem had made the same forbidden choice. They had seen the floating plasma crates. They had seen their doctors killed, and they too had broken the rules. They too had become doctors on the beach. The expert doctrine was dead, killed by the reality of Omaha Beach. The Goliath of the U.S. Army's own rules had been brought down by a handful of Davids with red crosses on their helmets. When General Omar Bradley, the commander of the First Army, reviewed the casualty reports, he was stunned by two things. First, the catastrophic number of casualties, and second, the miraculously high number of men who had survived unsurvivable wounds, men who were gut-shot, men with amputations, men who were in shock. Had lived. They had lived because a PFC had given them plasma on the beach, not a doctor in a tent. The validation was swift and absolute. There was no talk of court-martial. Ha-brook's forbidden tactic was not punished. It was studied. His actions, and those of the other medics, had proven beyond all shadow of a doubt that the bandage and morphine man was obsolete. They had proven that shock was the real killer, and that the only way to beat it was to get the plasma to the man immediately, not in a safe rear area that didn't exist, PFC. Ha-brook was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. His citation, read aloud by a general, was the official final validation. It didn't mention the forbidden part. It didn't mention the rules he had broken. It simply stated the facts. For extraordinary heroism, after being painfully wounded in the side, he continued to administer plasma. He was wounded a second time, and again, refused to be evacuated, stuffing a dressing into his own wound and continuing his work for 10 hours, saving the lives of over 70 of his comrades. His actions, and those of his fellow medics, forced the U.S. Army Medical Corps to change its doctrine. The expert plan was rewritten, not by generals in Washington, but by the blood of a PFC on Omaha Beach. After D-Day, the training for enlisted medics was revolutionized. They were no longer aid men. They were medics. They were trained, authorized, and required to administer plasma. They were given new, better kits. The doctor's tool became the medic's tool. The numbers tell the story. In World War I, if you were a soldier, your chance of surviving a wound that required hospitalization was around 81%. The system of rear area hospitals meant that thousands died of shock before they ever saw a doctor. In World War II, after the lessons of Omaha Beach, that number jumped to over 90%. At the Battle of the Bulge, just 6 months after Ha-brook's charge, thousands of American soldiers, wounded in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, were saved. They were saved because the enlisted medic at their side immediately started a plasma drip, a forbidden act that was now standard mandatory procedure. Ha-brook's suicidal choice had saved not just 70 men, but 70,000 more. And what of the humble hero? Ha-brook survived his wounds. He spent over a year in hospitals recovering. He returned home to Falmouth, Massachusetts, a quiet hero. Like the inventor of the bazooka, like the cook who silenced the ships, he refused the spotlight. He did not consider himself a hero. When asked about that day, he would shrug, his voice quiet. "I was a medic," he'd say. "I was just doing my job." The real heroes are the ones who never left that beach. He lived a long, quiet life. He married. He had children. He rarely spoke of the war, and almost never of the plasma or the 2 bullets or the 70 men. He was, like so many of his generation, a man who had walked through the fire and returned, carrying the knowledge of it in silence. The lesson of Ha-brook is the lesson of all great innovation. It is that the expert plan, the by-the-book solution, is often just a guess. It's a theory, created in a safe boardroom far from the front line. And sometimes that theory is dead wrong. Sometimes the true life-saving, world-changing innovation doesn't come from the top down. It comes from the bottom up. It comes from one PFC on a beach in a system that has failed him, who sees the impossible problem, breaks the forbidden rule, and in a single, audacious act of courage creates a new, better system in its place. Today, the legacy of Ha-brook is everywhere. The modern U.S. Army combat medic, 68W, the Navy corpsman, the Air Force pararescueman, these are not bandage and morphine men. They are some of the most highly trained trauma specialists in the world. They are, in effect, doctors on the battlefield. They are trained to perform surgical cricothyrotomies, needle decompressions, and of course, immediate fluid resuscitation. They are expected to do, under fire, what Ha-brook was forbidden from doing. The Ha-brook doctrine, the forbidden tactic of a PFC on a beach, is now the expert doctrine of the entire U.S. military. It is the legacy of a man who, shot twice and bleeding out, refused to die, and refused to let his comrades die with him.